Hello, everyone. I'm Sally Lynch, Development Director of the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you to this dialogue today. In partnership with the New Humanitarian, we are bringing together minds and spirits to address pressing and unprecedented global challenges. I truly wish the need for conversations like today's was not so urgent, but the challenges that have unfolded within the global humanitarian landscape are at the same time humbling, concerning, and extremely complicated. A sobering testament to our collective and converging reality is the staggering rise in humanitarian needs across the world due to conflicts, climate emergencies, economic factors, and a myriad of other complex drivers. The 2024 Global Humanitarian Overview issued by the United Nations earlier this month captures the challenges, hardships, and multifaceted needs of nearly 300 million individuals worldwide requiring urgent humanitarian aid and protection. In Afghanistan, Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the top 3 countries in need, more than 73 million people need immediate support. We hold in high esteem the tireless efforts of 3 Aurora Prize laureates, Jamila Afghani, Tom Katena, and Julian Lesenge, who are working diligently each day to provide assistance in these countries. This year, we've witnessed displacement, acute food insecurity, malnutrition, violent conflict and war, and the disproportionate burden borne by women and girls, highlighting the critical needs for immediate action and profound reconsideration of our approaches. Despite industrious efforts, the needs have surged exponentially, stretching the resources, strategies, and capacities of the humanitarian community to their limits. The funding gap between humanitarian aid and urgent needs this year was the widest it has ever been. For all of you joining us today from many different time zones and regions of the globe, I want to emphasize that the heart of today's discussion lies in our collective commitment to rethink, strategize, and mobilize to find a way forward. In order to rise to meet the enormity of these needs, our humanitarian community must rally to unify around a focused, robust, and tightly prioritized response plan that requires more than $46 billion to assist over 180 million people across 72 countries. Humanitarian action must be centered around acknowledging and amplifying the role of local and national actors, leveraging multi-sectoral partnerships, and ensuring people-centered, accountable, and inclusive responses while prioritizing humanitarian diplomacy to navigate increasingly challenging environments. I agree with the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, who stated that this crisis serves as a wake-up call, emphasizing the need to share the responsibility beyond humanitarian aid. More investment in fragile areas and marginalized communities, coupled with addressing root causes, is imperative. Despite immense challenges, we can find optimism in collective efforts to overcome these obstacles and create lasting positive change. Our collective action today will define the fate of millions impacted by crises. The time to act is now, and the cost of inaction is too dire. Thank you for joining us today and for supporting our Aurora community. Let's now extend a warm welcome to our friend, our partner, and someone who refuses to turn a blind eye to suffering, Heba Aly, CEO of the New Humanitarian, who will introduce our expert panelists and moderate this important discussion.
Thank you so much, Sally, and welcome everyone. And also a hello to Rethinking Humanitarianism podcast listeners who will also be tuning in. That's a podcast that I co-host about the future of aid. And if you want more of these kinds of conversations, do subscribe. I just want to start by saying, if you scroll through the New Humanitarian's website, we chronicle humanitarian suffering, and you'll find story after story of unmet need. You'll find the story of Mustafa Saleh al-Khatib, whose home was destroyed after the earthquake in northwest Syria in February. He's now homeless. He and his wife and 4 children are sleeping in their car at night and spending their days out in the streets, and they've been unable to get a tent from aid groups or a spot in a displacement camp. You'll find the story of Amina Mohamed, a 20-year-old who fled her farming town in Somalia in 2021 because of drought. She walked for 2 days and 2 nights with her sick child looking for help. And a week after arriving in an informal settlement on the outskirts of Mogadishu, she still hadn't received any food aid. And we visited her a second time 1 year later, and her situation hadn't changed. And you'll find the story of 2-year-old Selma, a Rohingya refugee from Myanmar, at a feeding center in Bangladesh. And in the wake of 30% cuts in the World Food Programme's food rations, a Rohingya writer recently wrote for us, "We understand the world has many urgent problems, but this is the wrong time to abandon Rohingya refugees." I share these stories to say that this unmet need is repeated over and over around the world, from South Sudan to Haiti to Yemen to DRC. And with every passing year, more crises get added to the list. This year, of course, we saw the conflict in Sudan, an earthquake in Morocco, flooding in Libya, and of course, the outbreak of violence in Gaza and Israel. And so every year, as Sally mentioned, the gap between the needs and the world's ability to meet those needs grows. So even while funding is increasing, about half of those who need help aren't getting it every year. And we can, of course, expect this trend to continue as climate change makes more and more places around the world uninhabitable, leads to more conflict, more displacement, more hunger, more death. So it's in this context that I have come to think of humanitarians as hamsters on a wheel, or to use another unfortunate analogy, it feels a little bit like a whack-a-mole, where you try to address one crisis and then another one pops up. And thus, I think it's imperative for us to ask the question of whether humanitarian aid remains the best tool to respond in this environment and under the so-called polycrisis, or whether there's a better approach to alleviating suffering. And if you think of a future in which financing hits a ceiling, in which climate change is creating new needs around the world, in which government restrictions are making it harder and harder for international aid workers to access certain areas. We're seeing that in Gaza, we're seeing it in Sudan and Myanmar and in Afghanistan. If that future is barreling towards us, how do we future-proof a system that aims to help people in need so that they can continue to fulfill that mission moving forward? So to discuss those questions, we've got with us today Damian Lilly, who is currently the Deputy Head of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Chad. In addition to several stints with OCHA, he has also worked with Doctors Without Borders, with the UN agency responsible for Palestine refugees, with the UN mission in South Sudan, as an independent consultant. And he joins us today in his personal capacity from Janah. Hi, Damian.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
We also have with us Janah, who is the Deputy CEO at Crisis Action, which works to protect civilians from armed conflict. She's a policy advisor, a governance specialist, a feminist, and has worked previously with Oxfam on Pan-African issues, as a policy advisor on poverty reduction to the South African development community, and as the executive director of the Center for Citizens Participation on the African Union. She joins us today from Connecticut because she was named a Yale World Fellow. Congratulations and welcome, Janah.
Thanks, Heba. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Third on our list, Deqo Mohamed is a Somalia-born obstetrician and gynecologist. She is a renowned humanitarian doctor, has spent years on the front lines fighting against famine, severe malnutrition, maternal death, and infant mortality. And she's the founder and executive director of Hagarla Institute, which works to improve public health in Africa through research, education, and community health delivery. She is most often based in Somalia, but joins us today from Miami. Hi, Deqo. And finally, Degan Ali has just joined us, executive director of the NGO Adeso, and also founder of a consultancy called DA Global that advises philanthropies, NGOs, and others on how to decolonize and localize their activities. Hi, Degan.
Hi, Heba. How are you?
Very well, and going to jump right in because we've got a lot of ground to cover. And I know, Degan, you're going to have to leave early, so we'll try to pack in as much as we can before you do. But Damian, I wanted to start with you. We heard at the beginning from Sally that the UN appealed this month for $46 billion to help 180 million people next year. And after seeing for years and years that level of appeal increasing, this is the first time that the UN hasn't appealed for more money than it did the year before. And given that it's hard to argue that the needs have decreased, I wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, I think it's a very positive development. First of all, I think what we've seen in the last few years is in some ways, obviously, the amount of needs get bigger, the gap get bigger at the same time, as you said. But I think there's been a certain element of mission creep with the humanitarian system that has been asked to take on issues that in many ways extend beyond humanitarian action. We've had a big part of the increased requirements was the COVID appeal a few years ago. We now have the elements of other health crisis. We have obviously climate change getting bigger, but we also have things like economic crisis that suddenly in Sri Lanka and other places that have given rise to humanitarian needs. And I think the question needs to be asked, do all these crises, important as they are, really represent humanitarian crisis? And I think there's been an effort to really narrow down on what is really meant by humanitarian crisis. There's also been an element of development, chronic problems, structural problems, in protracted crisis, and these appeals getting larger and larger, and in many ways humanitarian agencies substituting the work of other agencies, particular development actors who are risk averse to work in many of these contexts. So I think there's been a realization this is in many ways it's a turning point. And it has, as you said, it's the first time, I think, 10 years there has been a reduction. There's been a much more stronger emphasis on boundary setting and really narrowing down on what is really humanitarian need. Now, as you said, at the same time, we know the number of IDPs is increasing. We know that the number of people in food insecurity is increasing. So it's not that the problem is suddenly got easier. It's just that I think the humanitarian system has had a more stronger focus about what it can do, and I think that's welcome. It's better to try and focus and do something we can do rather than endlessly going on in a situation where we have unrealistic expectations.
It speaks to a piece that you wrote recently in the Humanitarian Practice Network blog that was called "Humanitarian Action is the Answer to Fewer and Fewer of Today's Humanitarian Crises." So I'd love if you could help unpack that. If humanitarian action is not the answer, and that, as you've just said, it should, have a narrower remit, what is the answer to these humanitarian crises?
Yeah, so I think I wrote that article basically with this realization. I think if the current or the previous trend, if the trend continued, we'd reach $100 billion required by 2027. I think for all of us, that is kind of unimaginable. And the system, how it's designed today, large international agencies going into countries, establishing themselves in crisis, is just unable to be able to respond to something of that magnitude. And I think when you look at it more and more, the proportion of actual humanitarian assistance or humanitarian aid in this crisis is quite small. It's not, in some contexts, it might be far less than, say, development assistance or now climate financing. So I think once you realize actually, we're just one part of a smaller problem, and we're one part of an ecosystem of different actors that are each playing their role, it's better to look at the entirety of all those actors together and to see how they can respond. So there's clearly is still a place, and we're seeing now in Gaza, and we've seen, the Turkey earthquake, when there's quick onset crisis, there's clearly a role for this very agile humanitarian system to move in and provide response. But in many other protracted crises that are going on for years and years and years, with added dimensions of climate and all these other issues, I think we need to look at the system and say, is it best just to work in that kind of way, which I don't think it is. And what would be more effective is if we looked at the sum for what humanitarian organizations are able to do with development actors, with peace actors and others, and look to redesign a system that clearly goes into these places and works in a far more joined up way, a far more unified way. Now, this is clearly happening. It's not to say that it isn't. We all know about the nexus and the approach to that and others, but I don't think it's happening in anywhere near the same way, that it could be. Now, this isn't going to magic away the funding shortfall. It's not going to, but I think it would be a more effective way of providing aid and support to these places. And in that sense, it would hopefully indirectly manage some of these unimaginable kind of funding issues that we're now seeing.
I want to turn to you, Janah, because Damian's talking about different players in the system coordinating more with one another and working more holistically together. I think Israel's bombardment of Gaza, before that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has raised real questions at perhaps a higher level about the quote-unquote system's ability to respect the norms that are meant to guide the conduct of war, and the multilateral system's ability to prevent and resolve conflicts in the first place. What to your mind needs to change, and in particular, I suppose the balance between those who are working to respond to crises versus those who are or should be working to prevent them?
Thanks, Heba. I really definitely want to build on what Damian is pointing out, which I'll paraphrase it in my own words and come to what you were saying, that what is said is, it's not that there is less need, but rather, yes, a refocusing on what humanitarian agencies can do, but what the issue is not that there's less people in need. We are not having the capability to help those that actually need help. And that is the crux of the problem. And for me, to answer your question, it's really set up in the current multilateral system that we have. I think more and more of us are calling for a reformation of the multilateral system we have, because we are not seeing it adequately responding to the needs and the issues that the world is facing today and that populations are facing today. And indeed, the numbers that we see in the overview report that was published recently, and the point that Damian is making, I think are a great illustration to that. And the calls really for me of not just reforming the UN Security Council, which I think is now a more topical and a lot more acceptable agenda issue, it's really the reform of the UN system overall. It is something that I'm really hoping that, you know, is taken a lot more seriously, because we are not seeing a capability of the current systems, not just the UN. I will also even throw in, for me, sitting and observing, and as a student of the African Union, the incapability of the African Union to also use its organs and institutions and systems to respond to the challenges that we are facing on the continent. When you look at even the current conflicts that are grappling headlines, the Israel Palestine situation, Ukraine, Sudan, and DRC, and many others, you are actually seeing that the norms that got adopted post-World War II of rules of how we can engage in conflict are actually now not being observed. You can grapple to think about which countries in the world today can you say are true champions of the international norms that we've adopted of how we conduct ourselves around the world. You cannot, because we've seen double standards in how those norms are actually being practiced, or in how the UN rules are actually being evoked. And so, yeah, I think I'm right now a loud advocate of significant reforms in our international system.
Towards what, Janah? What would you want that reform? What would the result of the reform look like?
I mean, beyond the more efficient, more capable institutions, because I really believe that we still need a multilateral system that helps all of us around the world figure out how to live well together. What I would like to see, though, is a departure on this continuous focus on investing in war. If you look at our humanitarian work, it's really a very reactive. We are responding to crisis. We are not taking time to think about how to prevent crisis. I would love to see a shift from big budget on defense but rather to actually see an investment in peace. If we can have countries that have a ministry of happiness, why can we not have a ministry of peace, where we actually say, how can we actually invest in protecting our peace? Because we know development, we know economic growth, we know innovation, we know well-being happens in a context of peace. But all our countries, most of our countries, invest significantly in ministries of defense, and not so much in taking time and in putting in place resources, including just human resources, to say, how do we respond? How do we protect peace? How do we ensure our country does not get to a place where it's in conflict within itself or with others? When situations break out, you will see a lot more investment in sending arms. But tell me right now, if at the Pentagon there is a fully fledged department that is thinking, how can the US support Ukraine, stop the Ukraine war? How can we help Israel, you know, and the people of Palestine get to a place of peace? The comparison of resource investment is significantly different, and you can then take it to all other situations anywhere else in the world. You know, there are countries like Costa Rica, like Iceland, they might be perceived as small, but I feel they've done radical things of ensuring that they don't even have military armies in their system. I think we need to see a world that's shifting a lot more to that and a lot less on investing in war.
I have to say that one of the things that came to mind when you were talking about ministries of peace is that the government of Ethiopia created one, and then look how that turned out. But point taken more broadly, and you mentioned the reform of the UN Security Council as one of the ways in which the multilateral system needs to change and might be more capable of moving towards. Degan, you have been on this quest to decolonize aid, and as part of your definition of that, you've talked about reimagining the entire global governance system in ways that are slightly different than what Janah's just described, and more at the level of, the inequality that allows or that leads certain countries to be in need of aid in the first place. So can you walk us through what a different model would look like that would help us get out of this trap of continuously rising humanitarian needs?
Thank you, Heba. I think we have to take a step back before we talk about what is needed. I think our analysis should be, we should have a common understanding of the problem. And while I agree with everybody what they have said, I think where I differ is that I don't think the reform of the system is really needed, or I don't think that how action takes place, how humanitarian action is where the problem lies. What I didn't hear enough is this understanding that the reason why we are in this situation is by design and is intentionally political. And we don't want to talk about the politics of the architecture and development and why there's conflict. There is a reason why what is happening in Palestine continues to happen, and we talk about it every few years when Israel decides to mow the lawn and commit genocide. It's accepted, it's part of the UN Security Council veto power, and the understanding, the unsaid thing is that Palestinians are supposed to pay the price for the sin of the Holocaust. And it's an unwritten thing that the Europeans have all agreed amongst themselves with the Americans. And who started this structure? Who put together this structure? Some of the worst actors in humanity. This is not a new thing. This is historic. You know, the French are committing genocide in Algeria while they are participating in the construction of the UN and writing human rights laws and conventions and all of that. To just look at that, the hypocrisy, you know. So this system was not designed in a way to be equitable. It was designed to ensure that the imperialists, the colonizers, still have power. And when they do something, they can get away with it. And they literally do get away with genocide every single day. What is happening in Yemen, what is happening in Syria, what is happening in Ukraine, in Palestine, in Congo, all of these are political issues that are either linked monetarily to what the West wants, financially, or they're linked and politically or strategically. So we need to understand that why we have political conflict that are unresolved year after year after year is because of that, is because of the structure. So I would take a different view, and I would say that we have two options. We can either completely get rid of it, recognizing that it is neocolonial, it is imperialistic.
What's it?
It is get rid of all the Bretton Woods institutions, get rid of the IMF, get rid of the World Bank, get rid of the UN, get rid of it all. And by the way, they have absolutely zero credibility. I think the nail is being put into the coffin right now of the UN as we speak. It has no legitimacy. The US has no legitimacy. The P5 have no legitimacy. The global South and the rest of the world know that. And that is why there has been this effort to have the BRICS get on overdrive. And I think whether we trust Russia, we trust China is irrelevant. The fact remains that the most blood on the hands of governments is with the West and with the North. And right now, global South countries have to either choose. Do they stay in the current system? They know what it stands for, or do they take a chance and leap of faith and hope to try to create something that's more just? So I think there is conversations happening as we speak about new architecture. There's new banks that are being established to compete with the IMF and the World Bank. I'm not suggesting all of this is going to be in place immediately. It might take another 20, 30 years for it to get established. It just creating the UN took 2 iterations. It was the League of Nations first, and then finally the UN. And it took many, many years. The Bretton Woods institutions, the same thing. So it's not going to happen quickly, but it is going to happen. And it might start off with some rumblings about reforming the P5 and the Security Council. And it might start off with peace processes led by the BRICS. And for at least Palestine, I'm not sure if it's going to happen in other countries. And if it does, and the US refuses refuses the agreements, refuses the challenge, the West refuses, the P5 refuses to give up veto power, then I can tell you right then and then, there will be a very quick need for the BRICS and the Global South to establish an alternative. So I think a lot has to do with what happens in the next few years and how the West reacts to the recognition that the West is falling. And they are no longer in the driving seat, and they have to share the car and with other people. So I think that's one option. The other option is the tweaking at the edges, is what I've been hearing. And honestly, I'm not sure tweaking is enough anymore. I think the situation we're in is so grave and so drastic that I'm not sure if just removing the P5 is enough. I think there has to be a whole new articulation of an entire structure of the UN. Who controls WFP? Who controls of UNICEF? Who controls all of these NGOs? These agencies, this assumption that it's always divided up between the US and the British and the other Europeans. So all of this has to be redesigned and renegotiated. So I would say that the politics of the system and what is the underlying root cause of all of these humanitarian crises, we need to understand it as humanitarian actors, that it's extremely political. And this is what I have been talking about when I talk about decolonization. It's the recognition that we are part of this small little sliver within global architecture. And we just keep talking about humanitarian action as if separated from this political architecture, and it's not. I'm sorry,
Damian,
I can't hear you.
I'd love your reaction to that. I hope you can hear me now. Sorry, I was saying, Damian, I'd love your reaction to this notion that actually the reason that all of these conflicts continue and all of these needs on the humanitarian side are rising is because of an architecture, including the one that is inherently privileging one part of the world over another.
Sorry, is that to me?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what others are saying, in so much as the multilateral system is you know, facing a severe problem at the moment. But I believe that we need to reinvest in it, and I think we need to find other ways. Certainly, you know, UN reform is part of that, but I don't think that we can kind of give up on all these multilateral institutions and ideas. What will replace it is, and what we've seen in many of these conflicts now, is just other powers, other countries stepping in, and I think that's even a more testing situation if we find ourselves there. I think in terms of going back to the humanitarian needs and how this plays out, is that we have an extremely unequal, you know, division about where resources go. We've had this appeal launched, and we know that it will be political determinations about where money ends up. It won't be necessarily where the need is greatest, and I think that needs to be changed. I think that the donors that are giving, and it's a certain small number of donors that do make up the lion's share of it, are, you know, providing to Ukraine, providing now what we're seeing in Gaza and other places which clearly are very much in need. But we have other places, you know, Myanmar, which are almost forgotten and where there isn't in any way the same level of attention. We have a system where there are, you know, donor conferences which are just launched on particular countries to try and mobilize sudden attention, which, you know, makes the headlines for a few days, but isn't a very reliable way for anyone living in these crises to depend on receiving assistance. There should be a much more of a way that when this appeal is launched, as much as possible, money is put in a common system that is then allocated based on where the need is greatest. It sounds quite idealistic, but we're far from that. I think that we wouldn't be beholden to many of these, you know, political concerns that, you know, others mentioned.
I wouldn't even argue it's idealistic, in the sense that we have seen models like that where the Global Fund or others that are more along the lines of a common pool of money, and there's been a whole push now for the notion of global public investment, where again, a more predictable way of financing global goods that is less politicized. So I think.
Heba, can I just interrupt here and just say, you know, if you talk to every single person who's in a refugee camp or people sitting in Gaza waiting for humanitarian aid to come in, or Yemen or Congo, none of them would say the priority would be to get us more assistance and fundraise more money. All of them would say, stop the abuse, stop the genocide, stop the harm that's being committed to us. And I wonder, honestly, I have a question now that just dawned on me as I was listening to you speak, about maybe the new vision about what could be created. There's a hugely diametrically opposed interests of the UN as implementing agencies who want to fundraise for these crises, who sadly, I'm sorry to say, act like vultures when a crisis happens. And all they're interested is about raising more money for humanitarian response, and the political action that causes it, that makes sure actually crises are not addressed. We see that right now. It's a live issue with WFP heads and UNICEF heads not talking about genocide and what's happening with their own staff in Gaza. So I think there's a huge conflict of interest to be an implementing agency to a humanitarian response, as well as be part of the UN system that is supposed to be resolving global crises and taking political action. And you see that coming to a head in the place of Gaza, where the UN agencies are so interested. UNICEF head is very okay with raising more money for UNICEF. while at the same time not calling it a genocide. That is, to me, just the utmost symbol of like hypocrisy. And so many things that are wrong in the system. And so I'm sorry, but I disagree with this idea that all we need is more resourcing or better understanding of how to make sure needs are met constantly. The resourcing for humanitarian response has been exponentially increasing the past 10, 15 years, but the crisis, none of them are getting resolved. Why? Because the UN does not have any backbone to hold the global north, the people who start many of these crises, accountable.
Deqo, I see that you're back and that you're nodding. So I'd love to bring you in now. And I think Degan has raised one part of how one part of the reason that these crises continue for years and years. You're operating out of Somalia most of the time. That's another context where we've seen a crisis last years and years. What for you is the reason that these needs never get addressed and the way out, as we've labeled the topic of today's conversation?
Sorry, thank you. Can you hear me now? Okay. Oh, I'm enjoying. I would be happy to be audience and just to listen to you guys all. Fantastic conversation. But my point is, I agree with you 100%. But the main thing we're forgetting is it's a disconnection. And UNOCHA can testimony for that. The more they make the cluster, the better the aid delivers, much better. So I think the miscommunication between all of us is the international NGOs, local NGOs, and government. If you want to deliver a specific change, it's not only for the aid. Aid is enough for first emergency thing, but next it has to be thinking. We should think how to develop better and how we can involve more. It's not only giving local NGOs some money, but building the skills, making sure they had a capacity to take over and to solve one of the biggest issues. I'm a physician, and if we want to solve anything, we need to find a course route. And I agree with my sister 200%. The point I'm going to add that is we have to allow people to take care of their issues locally. International NGOs should not have any foot on the ground. We should solve it. They are good at fundraising. Let them do what they're good at. But let us have a capacity to deliver the services as who we are. Because the service I can deliver, UNOCHA cannot deliver, or any international NGOs. And secondly, we have to push our governments to have a sustainable system that can support me and can put a better system in place. Otherwise, I cannot work by myself. I cannot recover. No matter how good doctor I have, my organization works, I cannot feel the position of my Minister of Health. So my Minister of Health has to function. And that international NGO, again, and UN can push, because they're the one who's giving the funding, they can push the system to be in a place and uncorrupted. And one of the issues I have seen, not political side of the issue, is the money side of the issue. While I was working in MSF, a lot of international on the ground, the money could, it's a business making machine, international NGOs. I couldn't print a car locally. And my car that I'm filling for my patient, international NGO, has to come from France and has to be shipped. And that's really frustrating. So if we shift the money, and war will not stop until we have manufacturing companies who are making millions of dollars. So we need to come up alternative. Those people can make money, not in the blood of the people, not in the blood of anywhere in Sudan, in Ukraine, in Gaza, what's happening, but how they can make money from somewhere else, not killing us. And international NGOs, we just have to say, thank you, you're good fundraising, you're good rallying, but let us cover ground because we have experience and we can deliver things.
But I guess the argument isn't just that you have the experience, but that if we imagine a world in which humanitarian needs continue rising, the model, and I think somebody mentioned it earlier, of international aid workers parachuting in is a much more expensive model and just simply won't be sustainable. In addition to the fact that if there are crises happening everywhere, as we can imagine in a future of climate change invoked chaos, sorry to be a bit alarmist, that you can't parachute people in because everyone's going to be dealing with with crises on their own soil. So I think that the localization agenda is about more than morality in a sense. It is also about, how this response is going to be possible in the future, but it often is framed in a way that is much more around how international NGOs can delegate or give a bit more decision-making power to local NGOs. Deqo, you have a different vision of what localization can look like if it really is going to, be an alternative way forward, and that is empowering governments. And yet in many contexts, like Somalia, that is often really challenging because donors don't want to pump money into a government that they consider to be corrupt or incapable, et cetera. And so how do you get around that challenge?
It's very, first of all, we have to stop bringing Western governance system. That's a number one. You cannot have a book and written policy and your idea and your rules to bring and functioning in Africa. I think as Africans also, we have to think how better we can be governed ourselves, not copying, policy in US or now Somalia become a federal state. And what exacerbated that is every state has a specific clan. So that brings back Somalia, a clan issue. We were trying to fight that clan issue in the last 30 years, and we were trying to be Somalis. Now we went back because it's federalization system, because we have to divide it 6 sections, and each section are run by clan. So if we want to stop that, is we have to educate ourselves. We have to empower ourselves. On top of that, international community and UN who's funding my government has a power. Somehow they do have a power to negotiate. They do have a power to say, hey, we do not want corruption. If you want to bring no transparency, if you cannot communicate, if there is not even 30 years in Somalia, last 10 years we had a government, but there's no one vote, one person. We still dependent on a parliament who's corrupted that you can buy them easily. If I want to become a president, for me, it's just having a couple millions. I can become a president in the country because I'm going to buy their votes, that should not happen. That should be one person, one vote. And we should have a so-called now, I don't want to even use that word democracy. It's overused and abused. So that's the thing we have to think. And build their capacity. Again, we need to build local governance capacity. Because what I have seen in COVID, when I tried first time closely working with the Minister of Health and Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, they were trapped in that place and the seats. They didn't even realize the power they had, and they couldn't even deliver a basic test of COVID because they didn't even know the steps to take. And it's very sad. It's very sad to see a whole system is not in a place. And they think I have to be here symbolically because I'm from this clan, I'm from this state. So there's a multi-level working. It's like building their technical skills, stopping bringing us the Western ideology of governance in ourselves. We need to come up with a way to govern ourselves.
It can be mind-boggling, I think, sometimes to come into a conversation that is about humanitarian needs and end up talking about colonialism and the Security Council and corruption. But the reality is, I think all of you have said it in one way or another, that is where the answer lies if these needs are going to be, gotten back under control. So Janah, I wanted to come back to you with a question from the audience, actually, linked to some of where we started and some of your comments. And this is from Sarah Goldsmith, who talks about the kind of limited successes in implementing high-level or UN type international fora gathering. The kind of reform that happens at that level hasn't had huge change. And she asks, does the humanitarian system have a chance for improvement, or should we just accept the limits and just be happy that at least some people in need are saved and helped?
Oh, no, I don't think we can be comfortable with what is currently the system and the case. And I think in light of the comments that we have all made, actually, it sounds like we are all speaking about different things, but we are actually all correct and right in my view. The issue is, I think if you listen to all of us, we're actually basically saying there's broken trust. We don't trust the UN. There's mistrust and distrust between the global south and the west. There's trust and mistrust between donor countries and recipients. I think Deqo is showing up between NGOs and local organizations. And so for me to come back to the issue of reforms, because again, I am quite, I do believe we still need a place where all of us in the world can come and agree on just the basic ways of living with each other and sharing this limited resource called planet Earth. And so I think we still need that platform and that space. All I'm saying, and I think in some ways we are all saying, currently designed and operating is not working for any of us. And that's why I would argue for reforms. And I would say that for me, what I'm arguing around the UN reforms is I see it as an initial step that will ripple into all the other systems and mechanisms and institutions around the world. But we do need some sort of alignment and agreement at a global level and reorganizing there, which will ripple into all our other operating systems, because all our other operating systems at the moment actually have been designed in response to the global mechanisms that are in place. I think it's very urgent, you know, just in light of the conversation that we've had today, of the statistics and numbers that we're dealing with now and the ever multiplying conflicts and climate-related incidences and situations around the world. This is ever more urgent to today. And just to maybe underscore one point that I really agree with what Deqo is saying about localization, I really believe it's also a way that will help reduce the resources that are required to deliver aid at the end of the day. It will be much more cost-effective to work with national actors to be the primary drivers of how aid is delivered within contexts and situations that is required, compared to the system where we have seen where we fly in from somewhere in the world, bringing in everything and so forth and so on. So in a world of limited resources, that's definitely a part of the future architecture, whatever it will eventually look like.
And I think the other driver or incentive is that increasingly we're seeing in this environment that you described of the West versus the rest, skepticism and, as you put it, distrust, even from the countries that are in need of humanitarian aid, in accepting aid from the outside. And I think that's one of the other complicating factors that leads a localized approach to be one of the ways forward, inevitably. If Degan had to leave, and it is her style to kind of drop a bomb and then walk out of the room, but if she was here, she would say that I'm moving the conversation back towards the tinkering around the edges rather than the fundamental change. But I wanted to come back to you, Damian, with a question from another member of the audience, David Yarici, I hope I've pronounced that right. And he says, in a world facing multiple crises, how can humanitarian organizations adapt to ensure flexibility and agility in their response strategies? And it reminds me of a notion that you introduced me to, Damian, around crisis response, meaning that, you know, there might be a humanitarian crisis, yes, but the response to that crisis might not be bags of rice or tarpaulin, but rather, you know, debt relief might be the thing that country most needs in that particular situation. So can you talk us through this notion of a broader crisis response, and how humanitarians can be a little bit more agile in what they consider to be an appropriate humanitarian response?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to understand the question, I think, you know, agencies do run around like headless chickens from one crisis to the next. They see the news, they move in, they try to play their role. And I think linking to what was said about localization, on the one hand, you know, what we see in many countries now is a rejection of, you know, aid. We've seen, you know, UN missions now finished in Mali, in Sudan, it will happen soon in Congo, places like Myanmar and others. You know, it's only through local actors that, you know, can respond in many of these places, which is positive for local actors. But going back to the question of international actors, the problem that localization is not moving forward is it's the same organizations that are competing for the same resources. And you have to picture some of these big agencies who are facing reduced budgets, who are going to have to lay off staff. They have no incentive to pass over funding to local organizations. Their primary responsibility is to pay people's salary at the end of the day. And I think that's, you know, that's holding it back. So this notion of, you know, agencies running to the next crisis, running to the next response in terms of chasing the money, it is a business, as somebody was saying, it is a market, and they are acting in this market. In some ways, we need to remove those kinds of incentives, provide much more flexible funding to agencies that they can enable to operate like that. I did a evaluation of IOM. IOM relies on 95% project funding. No wonder it doesn't have an ability with, you know, resources, core resources, to decide where the needs are greater. So I think from a humanitarian agency point of view, you know, they need to be supported with donors with far more flexible money, far more unearmarked, where crisis is going, and then they can determine where they can respond to. The other thing, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, was that, yeah, humanitarians are always only going to be a very small part of the response. It would make much more sense if we put together what humanitarian agencies are able to do, development actors, and see that in a far more joined up way to how we can respond. One level of leadership, one level of plan, one level of funding mechanisms. At the moment, donors feed this, you know, fractured system, because they provide development assistance on the one hand, humanitarian, another new fund for this. All these new funds, again, are just a marketization of the system. They're selling, not many of these new funds are selling ideas, selling a way to mobilize money in the hope that we will raise more money. But the end is it just becomes more and more inefficient. It'd be much better if we would reduce, have much more simpler funding mechanisms. The Swiss government have recently merged their humanitarian development funding. We should have a principle when funding's given, it doesn't really matter if it's used for humanitarian, it's used for development. Most of the activity is very much the same. So there should be a much more kind of flexible system where ideally the money be put together. We talk about not humanitarian response, development response, peace response. We just talk about crisis response. How do we deal with these situations in a much more joined up way? I think that's the way to go.
In the last few minutes, and I'm just going to run a couple of minutes over because I know we started a little bit late. I wanted to ask each of you, because we've covered quite a bit of ground in a short time and talked about very big issues that are hard to make sense of at times, and certainly hard to then operationalize. If each of you can think across the areas that we've talked about, whether it's a more joined up response the way you've been describing, Damian, or it's making a multilateral system that is more focused on conflict prevention, as you've talked about, Janah, or localization, Deqo. And for those of you who want to try to tackle Degan's comments around really a system that is designed to keep power in the West, what is either one practical step forward in that direction, or one example of success that you've seen towards that kind of approach that shows us how this can become reality? Because we talk a lot about what needs to change, but it's often hard to see how you can go about getting there. Do any of you have any rays of hope for folks?
I'm happy to start and say, for me, I see an opportunity in 2024 with this UN summit for the future. Again, maybe I'm a pragmatist in my political approach. I don't think you can completely do away with everybody. You build on systems and institutions and platforms that are there. That's why I probably believe in some reform, but I do think there's a huge opportunity to do some radical reforms and really change some systems and not just tinkering at the margins. I was really very, I was optimistic and felt sparks of hope with the recent UN vote, the UNGA vote on tax reforms, where your Western nations were going in one direction, but the rest of the world were like, hang on, we really need to reform this whole architecture. That's why I'm a bit more hopeful. And the opportunities that are being given by the UN for the Summit of the Future that's going to take place in September next year, I think there are a lot of regional dialogues on it. And I think that's where the UN reform agenda is also taking place. Different continents are coming up very vocal on the new UN that they would like to see. I know on the Africa continent, civil society is also being very vocal about the changes they want to see at the African Union. So I'm optimistic, and I think those are spaces where we can begin to continue, to really knock hard to shift structures and not just tinker at the margins.
Damian, what gives you hope, or where have you seen reason to believe this change is possible?
Yeah, I think we have to, as it's just said, we have to, still invest in the multilateral system. It's obviously imperfect. It's shrouded by terrible political dynamics, which are leading to terrible situations that we're finding in Gaza and elsewhere. But I think we have to stay the course. We have to invest in it. We have to hope there will be a turning point and it will get better. I think on the multilateral stage, I think one welcome thing that we've seen from a humanitarian side was recently at COP28, this declaration recognizing for the first time that humanitarian conflict, development, they're all interlinked, and very much climate change is very much a humanitarian agenda now. And I think that's a very positive declaration, but it certainly means a lot now to how humanitarians need to act. One concrete example of what we're seeing in Chad, in Eastern Chad, we've had, from the Sudan conflict, we've had refugees, more than 500,000 people have arrived in Chad. This is exactly the same thing as happened 20 years ago in Darfur, the genocide. It's astonishing the world has not reacted in the same way when Darfur was in the top of the agenda then, and now it's not even in the news whatsoever, and the situation's far worse. On a more positive note, though, the response in the East is very much different. Before, it was very much seen as just a humanitarian response, established refugee camps. There is recognition that it's a multidimensional crisis, that's developmental impact. Filippo Grandi came here with the managing director of the World Bank. The World Bank is heavily investing. It's very much this crisis response that I was talking about by humanitarian and development actors coming together in a joint plan. That is being led by the government. The government is finalizing at the moment its joint plan to bring all the fractured UN plans together into a single one that deals with humanitarian development and security. It certainly has challenges in how we're going to implement this, but I think in terms of trying to provide a positive example of kind of things that we need to do, I think that's the one that's kind of resonating with me at the moment.
Great to hear the nexus in action. And Deqo, last word to you. Where have you seen things moving in the right direction?
Oh, everything is said. I will just say, stop, accept. We have to stop the way we're functioning, and we have to accept the new norms. That's all what I will say. What we're doing cannot continue. So we have to stop the way we're delivering, where we're accepting, where we are doing things. And we have to accept giving the power people who has more power than we think.
As good as anywhere to end things. We are over time, so thank you very much, Deqo, Damian, and Janah, for your thoughts. And that brings to an end this Aurora Dialogue in partnership with the New Humanitarian. For those who do want to keep up with these questions around how best to respond to crises, sign up to receive the New Humanitarian's daily or weekly digests. We also have a new newsletter called Inklings, which gives you little musings around how aid works. So you can find all of that at thenewhumanitarian.org/subscribe. And after what has been, I think, a very difficult year, I just want to wish everyone a peaceful 2024, and may this conversation be one step towards finding ways to reduce suffering moving forward. So thank you all very much, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.